Friday, July 3rd, 2026. Welcome to WW3 Global Report, where headlines meet reality. 2 days ago, American and Iranian negotiators sat in separate rooms in Doha and called it progress. Qatari and Pakistani mediators shuttled between them. Officials on both sides used the word positive. The 2-day round ended without a breakthrough, but with tangible implementation steps. A goods purchase mechanism for the first tranche of frozen assets, a communications channel to flag violations, and an agreed focus on restoring passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And yet, in the same 24 hours those talks concluded, only 35 commercial vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz, compared with roughly 110 a day before the war began. If the danger has really passed, why is a fifth of the world's most important oil corridor still running at less than a third of normal traffic? That is the question nobody in Doha answered this week. Comment your day, date, and location below, hit subscribe, and drop the words "clear eyes" if you want the version of this story that doesn't need to shout to be true. Let's establish exactly where things stand, because the sequence matters more than the slogans. Roughly 2 weeks ago, the United States and Iran signed an interim memorandum of understanding, often referred to as the Islamabad MOU, building on the outcomes of an earlier summit in Switzerland. That fragile arrangement nearly collapsed last weekend when the two countries exchanged strikes following an Iranian attack on a cargo ship, a direct test of whether the ceasefire could survive contact with the strait itself. Both sides pulled back rather than escalate, and that stand-down is what allowed this week's Doha round to happen at all. Over 2 days, negotiators worked through two specific issues: a goods purchase mechanism for a first tranche of frozen assets, and a communications channel meant to flag and address MOU violations before they turn into strikes. On the money, sources differ on the scale. One account puts the frozen funds discussed at $3 billion, to be spent on humanitarian goods rather than transferred as cash, while another puts the figure at $6 billion, again earmarked for purchases based on Iran's stated needs rather than direct payment. That gap alone tells you how much of this negotiation is still happening through intermediaries rather than in the open. Before any of that could move forward, the calendar intervened. The next round of talks won't happen until after funeral processions for Iran's late Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei conclude on July 9th. So as of today, you have a ceasefire holding, a partial reopening of a critical waterway, an unresolved dispute over money that hasn't actually changed hands, and a week-long pause built into the process by events that have nothing to do with diplomacy at all. If the two governments genuinely agreed on the substance here, what exactly is left that requires a communications channel just to prevent it from breaking down again? That question points somewhere the headlines mostly avoid. Start with the loudest claim in circulation, that a return to full-scale war is imminent. The reality is more specific than that. President Trump himself downplayed the possibility of renewed all-out conflict this week, saying, "I think they've come a long way," and oil prices fell to their lowest level in 4 months on those remarks, with analysts cutting price forecasts for the first time since the war began. Markets do not rally on the expectation of imminent war. They price fear in real time, and right now the fear is easing, not building. That doesn't mean the danger is gone. It means the specific claim of imminent doesn't match what traders who have money on the line are actually doing. Now take the opposite claim, the one coming from Washington's own podium, that denuclearization is moving along well. Sources familiar with the talks say the mediation anchored by Qatar and Pakistan did not focus on Iran's nuclear program at all, the very issue that triggered the war in the first place. Vice President Vance himself said discussions on the nuclear issue would only begin later, which means the headline claim of nuclear progress and the actual content of this week's talks are describing two different conversations. This is a textbook example of how a media narrative goes wrong, not through fabrication, but through officials describing aspirations as achievements and outlets repeating the phrase because it's quotable. The same pattern shows up around the word breakthrough itself. This round of talks resolved logistics, how frozen money gets spent, how violations get reported, issues both sides had already agreed on in principle 2 weeks earlier. Coverage described the talks as concluding with no sign they had made headway toward a lasting peace, focused instead on issues previously indicated as largely resolved. That's not a breakthrough, that's implementation, which is real and useful, but it's a different story than the one being sold. If both governments benefit from the public believing more was settled than actually was, Washington gets to claim diplomatic momentum, Tehran gets breathing room to rebuild. Who exactly has an incentive to correct the record? Nobody is the honest answer, which is why the real decisions are happening somewhere other than the podium. Consider the toll dispute, because it is the single clearest fault line in this entire process. The memorandum bars tolls only during its 60-day term and does not rule out charges afterward. Iran has said it will begin assessing tolls on shipping starting in mid-August, once that toll-free window expires, while Washington has rejected any Iranian-led tolling mechanism as unacceptable, and Tehran has publicly asserted joint sovereignty over the strait alongside Oman. That is not a rhetorical disagreement. It is a fixed deadline with two governments holding incompatible legal positions, sitting quietly underneath all the language about positive progress. Now layer in the money. Neither side has actually moved funds yet. What was agreed is a mechanism, a promise of a process. A U.S. official close to the president said Trump was privately frustrated by the Strait attacks and asked to be briefed on military options before being convinced to let negotiations continue, which tells you the calm public statements coexist with a much shorter fuse in private. Meanwhile, the physical hazards in the Strait haven't disappeared just because negotiators are talking. Several European countries have offered to help clear mines from the waterway, but Germany's defense minister said he did not expect his country to participate, citing Iran's unwillingness to cooperate. A live minefield doesn't care about a memorandum schedule. It only takes one merchant vessel making the wrong turn to reignite the exact crisis both governments claim to be resolving. And the war's other fronts haven't gone quiet either. Israeli drone strikes, artillery shelling, and explosions continued across southern Lebanon this week despite a separate framework agreement meant to end hostilities there. That's the proxy escalation risk in real time. Actors and theaters outside the Iran-US table that can drag both governments back into conflict regardless of what Doha decides. Put the scenario framework together and it's genuinely simple. De-escalation requires the frozen fund mechanism to actually deliver goods, mine clearance cooperation to begin, and the toll dispute to be resolved before mid-August. Wider conflict requires just one of those three to fail, or one more incident like the vessel attack that nearly collapsed this deal a week ago. So here is the sharpest question in this entire story. With a fixed toll deadline landing in mid-August, nuclear talks not even scheduled to start, and the next diplomatic round delayed a full week by a funeral. Which of those three pressure points is most likely to break first? The money, the waterway, or the nuclear question nobody has touched yet? Start with the calendar, because it answers more than any statement from either capital. The toll deadline in mid-August is fixed and non-negotiable by nature. A legal trigger, not a mood. The nuclear question has been openly deferred, which means it cannot break this specific process before it even opens, though it remains the reason the war started at all. That leaves the waterway itself as the most immediate pressure point. A fleet of ships, including a U.S.-sanctioned tanker, sits stranded near Hormuz Island, and GPS spoofing that plagued the region for months has only eased noticeably in recent weeks, meaning navigation risk is down, not gone. Watch 3 concrete signals over the coming weeks rather than the statements coming out of either government. First, whether the frozen fund mechanism actually delivers purchased goods, not just an announcement that it will. Second, whether vessel traffic climbs back toward that pre-war baseline of roughly 110 ships a day, since a real return to normal shows up in shipping data before it shows up in a press release. Third, what happens the moment talks resume after July 9th. Whether the toll dispute gets addressed directly or gets deferred again, because deferral is itself a signal that neither side has a plan for mid-August. Here is the one concrete takeaway worth remembering. Numbers are harder to fake than statements. A president can say denuclearization is moving along well, while sources confirm the topic wasn't even raised. A vessel count cannot lie about how many ships actually moved through a strait in a day. When you're evaluating any report on this conflict going forward, ask which category the claim falls into. Verified shipping data, tracked financial transfers, and documented military movements sit in one category. Adjectives like constructive, positive, and moving along well sit in another. That doesn't mean the diplomatic language is dishonest. Sometimes progress genuinely is incremental and hard to quantify, but it does mean you should weight it accordingly. Notice, too, when officials claim progress on a topic that sourcing tells you wasn't discussed at all, that gap between claim and content is one of the most reliable tells in any conflict coverage. Going back to how the 2015 nuclear agreement was sold before its 2018 collapse, and how the fallout from the 2020 killing of Iran's top general was framed by both governments in the days after. This isn't a new pattern. It's the same pattern running again with higher stakes and a live minefield attached. Loud headlines are common. Clear thinking is rare. Do you see what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now as pressure tactics, real danger, or both? Put your answer in the comments.